Welcome to Films That Time Forgot, where we excavate hidden gems in cinema that are due for reappraisal. Oftentimes, horror films can function as allegory, revealing hidden meanings that express the culture's collective trauma at the time. In the case of Southern Comfort, it's about a nation finally coming to terms with the effects of war and how it polarizes the population. Today's episode is focused on cult director Walter Hill's 1981 survivalist horror masterpiece, Southern Comfort. Southern Comfort is centered around a group of 9 Louisiana-based National Guardsmen who find themselves lost in the desolate bayou on a routine patrol mission. They discover what appears to be an abandoned campsite and decide to use the canoes. A misunderstanding erupts between them and some Cajun locals who return for their property, when the buffoonish Private Stuckey fires blanks at them as a joke. This confrontation ends with the commanding officer dead, Sergeant Poole. Pieces of his brain matter sink to the bottom of the swamp. The military men find themselves prey in foreign territory. Various feuds and clashes of personality between the men in the unit prevent them from unifying against their enemy. From there, they struggle to survive, let alone find their way back to base as they are picked off one by the locals they antagonized. Although Walter Hill claims that the film was not intended to be an allegory for USA involvement in Vietnam, it still functions as such. These men are abandoned by their government and left to contend with an enemy they don't quite understand. The platoons bickering back and forth echoes how polarizing the war was to many Americans. It was a war that not everyone could get behind and was fought to win hearts and minds against the spread of communism rather than to protect us from an actual threat. Like Vietnam, the unforgiving wilderness is another adversary to contend with. Ill-equipped to deal with the elements at hand, the men succumb to paranoia and cease to trust one another. Friendly fire ensues and it becomes difficult to differentiate friend or foe. Like the Vietnamese, the Cajuns take advantage of knowing their home front by utilizing deadly booby traps and turning nature itself into a weapon that can be harnessed. They are an enemy that's often unseen, appearing sporadically to sniper a guardsman from afar. We only see the rare article of clothing, obscured by a tree. Other plot elements reflect real-life occurrences from the war. When the squad discovers a cabin belonging to a one-armed Cajun, the unhinged Corporal Bowden detonates the TNT inside, almost killing members of his own squad. Irresponsible actions like this recall war crimes like the My Lai Massacre, where over 500 unarmed Vietnamese, including women and children, were killed. The kill anything that moves mentality has taken hold as they hold the mysterious prisoner, not even knowing if he's with the ones they're fighting against. Their behavior and motivations are foreign to us in the characters of the film. Their way of life is painted as primitive, and the National Guard arrogantly assume they can interrupt their way of life in order to fulfill their own mission, which really isn't important in the grand scheme of things. It's impossible to ignore the elephant in the room that is Deliverance, which Southern Comfort is often compared to. It's even referenced in the film's poster. The 1972 John Boorman film captured America's anxieties about rural landscapes and the mysterious folks who inhabited them. Dissecting the tension between social classes and Southern masculinity, it kick-started a wave of exploitation cinema where city folk find themselves underestimating Southerners who exact their vengeance. Films like Gator Bait, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Eaten Alive followed. Whereas Deliverance relied on realism, these films had a heightened reality that only reinforced stereotypes of the South. Comfort avoids this by stressing how responsible this group is for their circumstances.
Because a bunch of assholes stole some boat.
The Cajun villains are relatively sympathetic in reacting to the aggression they received. Like John Carpenter's 1982 film The Thing, isolation breaks each individual character down until they are merely a shell of who they once were. The films even share a cast member, T.K. Carter, who played Knowles in The Thing and Tyrone here. Both films also deconstruct masculinity, sharing an all-male cast and dissecting how power dynamics work within such a group. There is even the presence of an incompetent commanding officer who struggles to command respect from his subordinates and whose authority is quickly usurped.
Oh, God damn trying to do my best. I know you are, Casper.
Characters may be archetypes rather than three-dimensional human beings, but this is done on purpose. Each of the men in the platoon demonstrate what war can do to a certain type of individual. Corporal Charles Hardin and Private Spencer are the most competent and level-headed of the bunch. They are simply there to do their job, and the only sin of theirs is hesitating to take leadership. When it becomes clear that Sergeant Casper is too indecisive and thin-skinned to lead the men.
I'm with you, Spencer. Casper, you are never gonna find that fucking highway.
Stuckey and Corporal Reese represent the darker side of humanity, those who use war and pride in their military or country as an excuse to act out their bloodlust. The conflict has simply awakened something intrinsic to their makeup, a dormant evil. Private Sims and Tyrone are the two most amiable and agreeable of the platoon. In fact, it seems like they aren't cut for the military at all, given their docile nature.
I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not supposed to be here.
Like many veterans of the Vietnam War, Tyrone uses drugs like marijuana to cope with what he sees and numb out his surroundings. The only African American in the unit, the other's treatment of him mirrors the treatment of many African American soldiers during the Vietnam War. Being the first fully desegregated U.S. war, African American soldiers were often the first put into hazardous positions and suffered disproportionately higher casualty rates, despite representing only 11% of the U.S. population. Walter Hill is one of the most underrated filmmakers in genre cinema. Inspired by westerns and Greek tragedies, his films often have a mythic quality that transcends reality, as seen in the films like The Warriors and Streets of Fire. His protagonists are often in the Gary Cooper mold. Like Tony Soprano said,
"Whatever happened to Gary Cooper? The strong, silent type."
They defy authority and convention. Hill's focus is on atmosphere. The film builds tension steadily and contains a worldview that is nihilistic and deterministic. Well aware of the symbolism people would take away from the film, Walter Hill told his crew this: "We were very aware that people were going to see it as a metaphor for Vietnam. The day we had the cast read, before we went into the swamps, I told everybody, people are going to say this is about Vietnam. They can say whatever they want, but I don't want to hear another word about it." Ry Cooder, legendary session musician known for his work with the Rolling Stones, provides the score to the film. Most of the music within the film is used to connect transitional scenes, where the platoon is traveling from one point to another. It's ethereal and comforting, which is ironic given the nature of the film. A bulk of the film uses only the ambiance of the bayou to soundtrack the events of the film. The dreary color palette is almost monochromatic. Gray waters of the swamp are set against a backdrop of blurry greens and brown forestry. The olive-colored uniforms of the platoon create a hypnotic effect. The thicket of trees loom over the characters. The film alternates between framing the group in either picturesque wide shots or up close and personal through claustrophobic close-ups. Shot in the cruel winter on the Caddo Lake over a 55-day period, the cast and crew suffered almost more than their respective characters. Actor Powers Boothe remembered, "The actors would clamber out of the muck just to get back into it. The situation was harder on the crew. They'd set up a camera platform and it would slowly sink into the bayou. Or with a tripod, one leg would sink. And how can actors hit their marks in 2 feet of water? I have to give Walter Hill credit for making the shoot as endurable as possible. We didn't lose our sense of humor until late in the shooting. Taking 2 weeks off at Christmas time helped keep our sanity. The nature of the story meant there was little need for production design. Since everything was shot location in the bayou, everything was authentic. There was no need to dress up, or in this case, dress anything down. The locations like the cabin at the pig roast were real settlements. The editing and pace of the film is characteristic of most films from this era. It's more meditative and deliberately patient. Establishing shots of the swamp go on for a lengthy amount of time to establish mood and tone. It's not until the final showdown at the pig roast where all hell breaks loose. The dialogue alternates between being on the nose and really naturalistic. The burgeoning friendship between Hardin and Spencer is particularly compelling.
No actress has got a good sense of humor. What's it to you? I just thought if I got out of here and you did, maybe I'd look her up.
And their banter really does capture the spirit of two men trying to find humor in their situation, despite the oppressing gravity of what's been going on. What could have been a forgettable B-movie ends up transcending its exploitation roots through razor-sharp direction on part of Walter Hill and the power of its symbolism, even if unintentional. It is more than a Deliverance spin-off. Its depiction of male group power dynamics and the various ways men must display their dominance over one another, however stupid, is a precursor to The Thing. The singularness of its location provides an almost cosmic horror. Its legacy can be seen in films like First Blood, Predator, and even more modern films like Dog Soldiers. While all of Walter Hill's films will be in the shadow of his iconic 1979 film The Warriors, Southern Comfort proves that Hill was capable of capturing that energy again, no matter what the setting or context was. This has been another episode of Films That Time Forgot. Please let me know in the comments what other films you'd like to see reappraised or reviewed. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.